Good morning. I'm going to give this to you all, and I will talk here. Thank you very much for coming out this morning. It is a gorgeous spring, almost spring day in Knoxville, and everything's blooming, and I'm so happy that I've survived another winter. We have a very important topic this morning, education, and 3 actual experts on what's happening with education in the General Assembly. And I'm going to let them we know who they are, but I would like them to tell which committees they serve on and chair, because it's complicated. There are 2 education committees in the House. So we'll get started. First, let me recognize all the electeds. Senator Briggs, we're happy you're here as well this morning. Commissioner Schoonmaker, Bob Thomas, Marshall Stair, saw you, County Commission, City Council, Dwayne Grieve, Vice Chair, Vice Mayor Dwayne Grieve, newly inducted. Anybody else elected? Patty, there you are, Patty Bounds. Thank you for coming this morning as well. Russ Oakes is here somewhere. He may be hiding out just in case, but thank you for being here as well. We want to make this very interactive this morning. If you have questions when they talk about what's happening with legislation, raise your hand and ask them, and we'll try to get those answers. But we'll get started. But Roger, would you tell us which district you represent and the committee you serve on?
I represent the 89th District, which is Farragut North, Carnes, Hardin Valley, Solway, basically Northwest Knoxville. I'm on insurance and banking because I'm an insurance agent by day and a super agent by night. And I'm also the chairman of the Education, Instruction, and Programs Committee, sub-chair for the subcommittee.
I'm Bill Dunn. I live in Fountain City, so I represent that area, Halls, Brickey, Powell, and then go north up into high school. And I serve on Representative Kane's subcommittee and, of course, the full committee of education. I'm on it because I'm passionate about children and getting education right. And then I'm also on finance, which deals with the funding of our schools. And I chair the Calendar and Rules Committee, where every single bill has to come through before it gets to the House floor.
I'm Harry Brooks. I serve on both education committees. I'm the chair of administration and planning, and also on calendar and rules. From that standpoint, I live in the Ritta community, represent the 19th district, and that includes if you're in the area for Gibbs or Carter, and if you're outside the Metropolitan Halls area, I have some precincts there. And I also serve a big chunk of the South Knox County area. That's from the river in the southeast section over to the Chapman Highway, primarily in the rural section.
All right, Harry, just keep the mic and we'll get started. First thing that's been a really hot topic here locally is about higher ed funding. There is a bill that I think's passed in the Senate sub maybe to strip University of Tennessee's $8 million of funding from their Office of Diversity. The bill basically says it would take away all state funds, leave federal funds, but I think there are no federal funds, if I'm correct about that. But so Harry, where is that, and what's the discussion, and is this something that's going to pass, or is it just fun and games and blood sport? That's what I call it.
It's dangerous to have the mic in your hand. That's what I just told Bill. I said I was going to give him the mic. He said, I don't want it. The issue with the funding of diversity, I think Senate, one thing I want to recognize is that there is some sort of little upset from the legislature in reference to issues that have popped up on the news. If you've seen an item on the front page of the paper relates to higher education, the legislators read those papers as well and have enormous numbers of calls from their constituency. And the general question is, why are we spending state money to do X? So whatever the headline is, you can fill in for X. So that's the general kind of trend with the public. So I think the Senate, I'm not sure what or why or how, but the first bill that we'll be looking at that deals with that diversity issue by one of the House members is looking at a process that we're very surgically looks at about $476,000. And that's the entity that deals with the issue that you read about concerning the pronouns and the Christmas stuff and those kinds of concepts. So that particular House member is looking at that particular concept in reference to any kind of a cut. So we'll see how that goes. It's one of the, I don't know, first 7 or 8 top 10 items on the calendar. So now he is amending his bill to have that kind of appearance, that type of conversation with him. So that'll be the first step. Now, what happens, I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But I promise you there will be a lot of discussion. It will not go calmly into the night. So, but that's kind of, did that answer your question?
Well, I think so. Bill and Roger, I'd be curious where you guys are.
No, I'll tell you just an interesting observation. Was it the week before when the UT administrators came down and we had several hours of hearing on this topic, and I believe UT had 5 or 6 folks who spoke for 2 hours on the importance of diversity, and it was just interesting that every single one of them were white males. So, you kind of look at that. Some issues get so poisoned it's hard to have a conversation about, and I think this is one of the issues that it's difficult to get to because there's so much going on out there. I believe in diversity, but I'm more of the diversity of the individual person. I don't think you should just be categorized by the color of your skin or whatever matters you have. In fact, sometimes I think it's counterproductive what we do because we focus on that one part of an individual, and so their whole being is, this is who I am, as opposed to the complete individual they are. Leadership Knoxville was down there Monday night, and there were several discussions about this. One gentleman got up and was very passionate about we need diversity in the workforce. So afterwards, when I spoke to him and said, just explain to me how this works in the real world, diverse workforce. And he said, well, it's easier to get federal grants if you've got a diverse workforce. And I think that's kind of a perverse incentive. I was hoping to hear him go more into you get a better product or this happens. In some industries you can see diversity of thought and experiences. I think, is it Kenneth Lowe who sent us a letter talking about what he does in his media thing, how it works. I can see that. But in other areas that might not be quite as important. The UT students came and they met with me this week, and we had a very pleasant conversation. Hopefully they heard some things that they could take back, and I heard some things that I can mull over. But I could actually go on and on, but I'll let Roger Kane have a shot at it.
Yeah, we had 2 different functions going on. The House really wanted to understand what the Center of Diversity and Inclusion does. That's why we had a joint education meeting. Both committees came. And we allocated 2.5 hours because so many people think the Center of Diversity and Inclusion is about one topic, and it's really not. They help minorities, they help women, they help veterans, and we really wanted to understand, what are we spending $5 million plus a year to do? Why do you have so many more people at UTK than you have at the rest of your diversity centers? Is there a double layering? Because not only do we have a Center of Diversity and Inclusion, every college has their own diversity coordinator within the college. So we wanted to understand the mechanics and how this whole thing works, and unfortunately it kind of went horribly the wrong way. I'm partially to blame. Okay, I'm totally to blame. But at the same time, we heard so much about workforce development. Well, I'm on their website and I'm looking at all their activities that are going on. There was nothing about workforce development. And it's like, okay, if it's about workforce development, you should be having training seminars and things like that to help these children. And then, the question was asked, we have children from all 50 states. We have children from all 95 counties. When do we reach a target? And there is no target that we can ever reach in diversity. And then my attitude too is it the university's job to teach diversity? Was that not your parents and your school? I mean, we get the fact that you might have come from a homogeneous community, but these children are so internet-based today that they're getting points of view from all over the world instantly. And I looked at the numbers. We didn't even get to that part because we ran out after 2.5 hours. But if you're spending $5 or $6 million a year, we've gone from international students being 1% of the university to 2%. Women have stayed static. The first to second year retention rate of students, minorities, African American minorities have gone down. Other minorities, we heard some explanation about, so many people are now biracial and triracial, that we have a new category federally. Those numbers went down. And I'm going, okay, are we spending and my son goes, Dad, it's like 0.5% of the UT budget. Why are y'all straining over something so small? I said, well, in my day, $5.5 million, $6 million used to be a lot of money. To me, it still is. And if you start adding those 0.5% together, eventually you kind of get a bunch. And no, I don't want to strip all the diversity funding. It does too many good things on campus. There's scholarships that they provide. But then that was another question that came up. If you're providing scholarships, why is that not going through financial aid? Why do people have to go to multiple locations to get a scholarship? Just have financial aid, a central location at the purser's office, and if you qualify for whatever it is, those people should be more experts than going around to 15 different facilities. And so there was just a bunch of stuff that came out of this, and it was much more than the media covered. So with that, I'll stop.
Well, there's going to be more to come on this, so stay tuned. There are other bills that impact UT. There's a freezing tuition bill. I know that's one. You had one on the Lady Vols logo, which is off the table for the moment. I guess there's also a bill about governance that allows UT would keep their board of trustees, but the other universities would also have their own board. So I guess what is prompting all of these higher ed bills and focusing so much on particularly this freezing tuition? I know tuition's gone up double digits almost every year for the last 20 years, but is there an underlying reason or something we're not seeing that is prompting so many of the bills aimed at UT?
There is actually a ton of legislation aimed at UT and many of the other, the TBR schools, because what's happened is so many of these things, whether it be the Zimmons or the Christmas or, the Lady Vols, whatever the issue is, we start finding out things that are going on our campus that, I guess in academia, there's no one to rein you in from the edges. And I told people the whole Christmas tree thing and the Zims it was an academic exercise never to be viewed by anyone. No one was to implement any of that stuff. It was just that's what we do in academia. You just kind of throw some things and you kind of see, but nobody ever thought anybody would ever implement these things. And of course, then it hits the media and it goes horribly out of control. But then you start finding out that there's things like, how the whole hierarchy of administration is done at UT. You then find out that there's things like meetings that are not open to the Sunshine Law, and I think some of our county commissioners can respect the whole Sunshine Law and what that does, and so you start having bills come out of this stuff because you find out that they're kind of running over there unheeded. There's no checks and balances really and so then you get the long arm of government coming in, which I find a fascinating phrase to be used because you don't mind taking our money, but then when we try to rein you in a little bit, all of a sudden it's the long arm of government reaching into the center of the university. And that's what a lot of this has to do with, is that we're trying to, we get the phone calls, just like many of our county commissioners and other people get the phone calls going, what are y'all doing? So that's what we're doing. But maybe Harry has a different perspective.
Yeah, I have a very similar perspective to what Roger's saying. And I think what we have to do in the legislature, I mean, a lot of us, to be quite honest with you, came unglued with all these issues. You know, some of us that are typically pretty calm, peaceful, kind of quiet, really lost it in some of these issues. And Roger's right, as you begin to kind of dig into things, you find information, but what the legislature has to do is that as we work our way through all these suggested ideas, is that we don't want to, it's worse to create a problem that's worse than where you are. So sometimes it's better to say, let's think on this a little longer. Because you can really create a bigger mess sometimes if you jump into it too quick without a whole lot of discussion. So you kind of take the ideas and you apply it. If we take this idea and apply it to day-to-day operations like at Pellissippi, at TCATS, at wherever and whomever, while we have it at work, but the reason on the original question, why is there a lot of attention to higher ed, drive to 55? You know, I think sometimes we've lost that in the midst of all these other legislative thoughts. So, you know, it's sometimes discouraging to see our emphasis on things that could very well put a great big bump in the road to drive to 55. But if we manage these ideas well, then we'll come out of it with concepts and policies that will help us in the drive to 55. Because in the state of Tennessee, our economic development program is education. If we don't get that right, K-12 and higher ed, you can kick our economic development down the road and get rid of it. Because if we don't get our education right, everything else is going to fail. So that's critical in that standpoint. We will adopt a policy, and then a week later we'll say, wait a minute now, we voted for this, but I like this one over here, and we're prone to swift, change with the wind sometimes, and kind of like the tide. But we've established a policy with the Focus Act that's very clear, unanimous so far, I think, through the legislature or close to it, that says that THEC is going to be the folks in charge. They're going to be the ones that are demanding the efficiencies. They're going to be the ones that are going to be looking at the financial aid. They're going to be the ones that are going to set tuition ranges. They're going to be the ones that determine priority was the construction and whatever else we're doing. And those are going to be the leaders. We changed substantially their responsibility. It's no longer a suggestion about tuition ranges. It is going to be this range. So that's a huge shift. So we've got this hierarchy that says we're going to consider all the entities in higher ed and still march toward the drive to 55. But we're going to work collectively with all these ideas because you can't take one and stand it alone. You've got to take all these concepts and they've got to merge together to be effective in higher ed. So the efficiencies, the financial aid, the tuition in regard to the government funding. I've been around long enough. Years ago, the language was this. We don't have a whole lot of state money, but we'll just let the tuition take care of it. Now, that was a policy. At one time, the tuition in the state of Tennessee, the bulk of it was state funded. It is not today. Who made those decisions? The legislature made those decisions. It's not anybody else we can look at. Don't look at your universities and colleges. We made the decision to say we want to jack up the tuition. We want to change the ratio. That was clear discussion. That was the direction we were doing in policy. And we wanted to reverse that policy, but I think the process that we've got in place with the Focus Act is the best way to do it. Let the THEC make those recommendations, and they're in charge.
Harry, you have a bill that would bring more transparency to the UT leadership. Explain that, and where is it right now?
Whenever the newspapers, let me get a sip of this coffee first. Whenever we begin reading the issues in the paper about problems at UT or concerns or issues with the diversity, and I begin the process of going back to the code. What does the law say about the UT Board of Trustees? what does the law say about who's in charge? Because there were a lot of questions, who runs the place ultimately? And it's very, very vague. Some of that statute is 1800 vintage. Not that that's bad, but there's a lot of things that have changed since then. We have more than one campus. We have now a chancellor at different campuses and the directors in regard to the institutes. So that's very different than what was envisioned when that original language put in there. So I began working at that point, and my objective was to do these things, to create clear language of what the Board of Trustees do, and once they appoint the chancellor, once they approve and appoint the president, who now is responsible? And we created very clear language that once that is done, the president is in charge. The chancellors report to the president. They serve at the pleasure of the president. If the president seeks to dismiss a chancellor, it can be done in that language without board approval. We've got to have a clear chain of command. Because in going through some of those issues, there were concerns about who's going to be doing what and who is going to be the last person where the buck stops, as Truman would say. But that's reality. The other part of it was, if you read, and I looked at the code for the Board of Regents and the code for, we're developing the code for the other new universities. What do the boards do? What are their responsibilities? So went through that process, looked at their individual internal kind of policies of what they do on the board. Looked at other boards around the area and set up some specific committees within the boards, some of which exist in their current operational plan, a lot of which don't exist. So we created a board in reference to a multitude of responsibilities similar to a lot of other boards in the area at other colleges and universities. Clear responsibility of what the board is to do, clear reporting in regard to the activity, clear transparency in regard to public input and public information, clearly in the language that the board shall establish a process where the public can make comments directly to the board. There's a process of gathering that information and a process in that code being proposed to where the board listens to the folks in the community. In all those different areas, even the issue of diversity, it now puts responsibility back to the board about those particular questions that arose. Issues with athletics, now there's a committee on the board that does that specifically today. That's in that legislation. So it's a combination of trying to address that, but ultimately the issue is transparency, responsibility, where does the buck stop? That's what it's trying to do, and that's what, when I began working on that months and months ago, that's where we are today with the language. And, you know.
Before we leave UT, I don't see anybody from UT in the audience. I was going to ask you.
I saw Joe Johnson.
Oh, Dr. Johnson. I'm retired. Yeah?
Want to come back?
Any comments? Dr. Johnson, do you have any thoughts? All right. Well, I appreciate all of that. Obviously, the University of Tennessee is a major player in our community and one that's very important to everyone. And you all have certainly kept them in the news this session. Representative Dunn, it's your turn. Bill came in this morning and said, what's left of Bill Dunn? If you read the morning paper, columnist Mark Harmon took a good shot at Representative Dunn in a little bit of a satire.
He wouldn't do that.
UT professor Mark Harmon.
Right.
Another reason to cut UT. So.
You know, blood sport. What did I say? Bill, you told us, you mentioned in our government.
Bless his heart, as we say in the South.
You mentioned in our Government Relations Committee meeting last week that you've introduced a proposed constitutional amendment dealing with state funding of local schools. Would you tell us about, I guess he took a shot at you on that this morning as well, in addition to vouchers, and we'll ask you a little bit about that as well, but would you first explain to this group what your proposed constitutional amendment is?
Sure. And the Constitution of the state of Tennessee currently says the General Assembly, as the elected representatives of the people, shall provide for the maintenance, support, and eligibility standards of a system of free public schools. That's where it stops. And courts in the past have decided that General Assembly sets policy. And so I talked to legal because I was very concerned about what's going on around the nation where unelected judges are starting to set educational policy. And so the language I'm putting in, according to the legal staff, this is to emphasize what is already in the Constitution. It doesn't take something out. And so, once again, the General Assembly, as the elected representatives of the people, shall provide for the maintenance, support, and eligibility standards of a system of free public schools, and then you just add, in such manner as the General Assembly may determine. So it just clarifies, emphasize what the policy has been. What's been happening across the country in different states, Washington State, California, Kansas, there's been many court rulings over the time that says, indeed, the General Assembly sets policy, the General Assembly sets policies, but then all of a sudden the court pops up and suddenly they say, no, we're going to kind of determine policy of what it's going to be. And I think it's important that the people of Tennessee, those of us who are elected, the school board members who are elected, that we're the ones who figure out what is an adequate education and how do we approach it. We should decide if we have half-day kindergarten or full-day kindergarten. We should decide, do we have year-round school or do we follow the pattern that we've done before? We figure out what the compensation is, whether we have block scheduling in high school or whether you have 7 periods. All these different things we should decide, because guess what? We're here today, we're talking to you, you can talk to us. Try to talk to a state Supreme Court judge. First of all, if you tried to talk to them about an issue, they would probably tell you, I can't talk about that outside of a courtroom because that may come before me, so I can't let you know, and you really shouldn't be telling me information. It needs to come through a lawyer. And so all I'm trying to do is keep it so that we determine where the dollars go. And I'll give you a good example. I know we just, a lot of times in government, we just focus on one issue and we don't see how everything works together. If you spoke to people who are involved in the schools, and Patty Bounds is here, they would probably tell you that a lot of what happens in the classroom is influenced by what's happening at the home, what's happening in the community. If a child has a bad home environment, they're probably going to bring it into the schools. Would that be accurate? Yes. And so sometimes if some judge comes and says you've got to spend $1 billion on K through 12, when actually those dollars would actually be better spent if we did some kind of intervention in the home and drug rehab or something like that. Because if we could fix the drug problem in the home, then the child would not be coming to school with nightmares, with the trauma of somebody getting arrested in the middle of the night, or not even being at school because somebody is strung out on drugs and so the child's not showing up. So it's important for us with our limited resources to figure out how best do we get where we need to be. And in some of these states where the judges come in and basically set policy and say how much you're going to spend, they never go back to say, did it work? Did it work? And when I started down my path of educational reform and really looking at it, it was around 98, the Department of Education put out a book, and I've still got it today with all my little notes and tabs and stuff. And this was right after the BEP, and the state had raised taxes. We doubled spending in K through 12 education from $1 billion to $2 billion. So I'm looking through there, wow, we've really increased spending, And then I get to the chapters on attainment. And in every category, ACT, SAT, work keys, which is what they had back then, scores went down. And so we focus so much on input. I'm a kind of guy that says, what are we trying to get and how do we get there most efficiently? And so I want to make sure that what the Constitution says is that we as elected people, we determine the policy of the state of Tennessee and how best to allocate limited resources. And we're held accountable because we're elected. Some people who are opposed to this are saying, so you're saying if the General Assembly just says, well, we're going to give every child a school book and that's free public school, then you can do that. Well, yeah, we can, but we are elected, and guess what would happen? If a judge comes in and suddenly declares, well, really education begins at birth. You know, the human being, that what happens to them at 6 months of age is just as important as anything else. And therefore, we declare that a free public education system has to start at 6 months of age. And it doesn't matter if it helped anything, but we would be forced to have a state property tax. We'd have to probably raise the sales tax. We'd have to do all that. And then if we found out it didn't work, we couldn't change it because they have declared this is in the Constitution. And the only way to do that would be to go through the whole constitutional process. And just let me quickly say that since this is a constitutional amendment, it has to pass this session by a simple majority in the House and the Senate. Then, next session, after there's been elections, it has to pass by 2/3 in the House and the Senate, and then it goes to the people. So it's a very long, thoughtful process, and it'll be very interesting, and I'm sure I'll be worn out by the end of it. And if anybody, well, I guess when we get to questions and answers.
I was going to say there are some people that say this is, along with the vouchers, that this is your attempt to sort of defund public schools and create more private schools or vouchers for private schools. Would you just respond to that?
You know, as I said in '98, and I used to be a 4-H agent, so I worked in the Granger County public school system for 8 years, worked with kids, and I'm very much student and kid focused. And I think a lot of these issues come down, are you for the student or are you for the system? And I'm not against the system. We need a strong system. But in the end, the reason we take tax dollars is to help these kids get ready for life. And so that's what I focus on. I don't want to do the trickle down, let's make the adults happy, and that'll kind of benefit the kids. I want to say, how do we benefit the kids? Because adults will be able to take care of themselves. They will, but these kids won't. And so with the governor's voucher program, we recognize that there are failing schools, and it's going to take a long time to turn them around. And in that time, do you tell a kid, by law, by truancy laws, you have to go to this school where 50% of the children never graduate, where 90% of the kids aren't proficient. That's what we're doing right now. And all what the voucher program was said, if you're going to one of these schools where you're on the path to failure, we're going to put you in a different environment and give you a chance. And that's all what it was. It's come up a couple votes short, and it saddens me every time I think about that these kids had a chance and now they don't. So.
All right, any questions on that?
And let me just say, I actually think the reform work that I've worked on all my time down there, whether it's teacher tenure laws, the evaluation stuff, we've improved public education. We are now the fastest improving in the nation. Other states are coming saying, what are you doing? Why are you zooming up? Why are your kids doing so much better? If I was trying to destroy public schools, I'd let them destroy themselves. Back in the bad old days when you didn't have this kind of stuff, when you didn't have accountability. When I was in Granger County and I'd walk into a classroom and the teacher would be up there just reading the paper. When the teacher would be up there with his baseball cards, sorting them out. When you had a TV with the VCR on a stand and it was the most used equipment because it'd roll from classroom to classroom so teachers would show movies to give themselves a break. I mean, this isn't second or third hand. This is what I saw. But now that we're focusing on the children and saying we are going to use our time and talent wisely, things are changing. And because public schools are improving, there's actually less of a chance of a voucher passing. So if I'm trying to destroy public schools, I'm doing a horrible job of improving because I'm improving them.
Well, let me say, for one, I don't think you're trying to destroy public schools, and I appreciate all the work you've done on education and other things since the time you've been there. Let's talk a little bit about Governor Haslam's budget. There's $261 million, I think, new dollars that are to be invested in K through 12, some to increase teacher pay. Is there consensus among the lawmakers on this? Are we going to see that much money put into the education budget this session?
I'm pretty confident we are. Of course, we also hear too, though, when a teacher's raise is given from the state level, it also means the county has to chip in. And we've had several counties go, please stop. Because even though you announce you're giving a 4% raise, many times the teachers get frustrated because they're not seeing it in their paycheck. That's because the county can't match what we're giving. And that to me is a little frustrating that we're giving the state portion of it and the counties are kind of going, it's not working for us because they've got to come up with those county dollars. Knox County does what they're supposed to do, but it's a lot of these other surrounding counties and a lot of the ones in West Tennessee that have more of an issue with this. There's just not the tax base because they've got to come up with an extra, $80 million or $160 million, and it's just not there. But I expect us to go through with the funding that the governor's had. I'm sure there'll be some tweaking that goes along as there always is, because right now we actually have a surplus, which that's really been fun to watch. There's been a lot of hands in that pot, but a lot of the times we have to remember this is one-time money, so we can't use it for things like teacher salaries and stuff like that because those are recurring. But the pot of unlimited projects across the state has been interesting to see. You probably don't want to put your hand in that bowl, but anyway.
They say we've asked a lot of the teachers, they've delivered, they deserve the pay.
Yep.
I think the bulk of it, 99% is going to happen. There's one item that probably will suck up a lot of the one-time money, and there's an effort to move $100 million into the state road aid for transportation, and I think that's going to happen. That is outside the scope of the governor's budget, but it'll, I think, become a part of it. That'll maneuver some money around elsewhere, but it'll provide several million to Knox County to assist in the roads. I know that one time, back years ago when I was with the Sheriff's Department, I was heavily involved in the budget preparation and got involved in the working on all of the budgets for the entire county. And at that time, the amount of money we were spending on roads for maintenance, it would take us 54 years to maintain all the roads. It's that kind of expense. Every 54 years we'll get them all repaved. And you just can't, that's not, it just won't work. So that's the reason why we're moving. I think that's going to occur. I think that's almost unanimous in the legislature. In the House, I'm not sure with the Senate, but I bet it's got strong support in the Senate. So, but I think the budget's going to pretty well be intact. There will be, as Roger said, there's going to be a whole lot of people going in there with budget amendments in reference to those dollars that are available. So it's always an interesting season when you got more money. Sometimes it's easier when you don't have a whole lot of money because there's less, options to choose from. But anyway.
Much easier to say, no, we don't have any money. Anything happening this year? What's happened with Common Core and standards and testing? That was the big issue. It has been the last 3 or 4 years. It seems to not be on the front page this year. Have we solved all of our issues, Harry, when it comes to standards and testing?
I think we have, and I think the legislature set a policy that said this, that the standards need to be Tennessee-derived standards. So the legislature passed legislation that said that. So we went back and literally enlisted educators from all across the state in multiple levels. Input, we put all the standards on the website, 30-some thousand suggestions. Took that information, solicited teachers from all across the state, and developed a process of creating Tennessee standards. The conclusion that I've heard from the folks in higher education, as well as K-12, was that they're more rigorous, much more applicable, much more tiered in the sense of what do you do in the second grade and the third grade and the fourth grade as it relates to math or language arts. So that has been occurring in their Tennessee standards. Now, is everybody going? Well, of course not. We're in Tennessee. I don't care what you pass, there's going to be an issue, but that's fine. And it requires by law every 6 years you go back and review these. So the process is in place for every standard that this state has. And that's the model that we're using for everything from science to social studies to math and language arts. And the bottom line so far is that all the new standards that are there, much more rigorous, much better, much clearer, and easier to develop curriculum off of.
What about 10 Ready? That was unfortunately had a small disaster. Are we going to fix that problem? Are we going to do paper and pencil for the rest of 10 Ready?
I'm reminded of reading some articles years ago about issues with some of our major platforms. I recall a time or two that some of the major ones blew up 10, 15 years ago. We're just now getting into the aspect of digital evaluation. The schools that are involved in the digital material, the laptops, the computers, the iPads, the entities that are the online schools, by the way, there's 6 or 7 of them in Tennessee. They were ready for this because that's what they do all day long. So, but there are some folks, it was a struggle to move them from a paper and pencil into digital. That's why we gave every LEA the option to say yes or no. So every LEA made a decision to do digital, online, or paper and pencil. Well, the blame digital blew up, but ultimately we're going to get there. You know, how many of you got a cell phone?
Everyone.
Everybody? Now, how many of you had a cell phone 15 years ago? Some did, some didn't.
Had flip phones.
Now, is the one I'm holding in my hand, according to my friend at AT&T, is the state of the art. Isn't that correct, Alan?
A little plug.
But the reality of it is, we got to get there, and it's going to take us time. And it blew up. It was an absolute wreck. It was, however you want to describe it. I mean, the network system just crashed. The platform on the state end was okay. The transmission on the local end was okay. It was a network that just couldn't handle it. So but we're going to get there. It's going to take time, but that's where we've got to go. We have got to create an environment to where we can give that test in May. What's the Knox County's range on that? The testing window.
Forever.
But there was a time frame you all adopted.
I don't know. They tested last week for the most part, and they will be testing again.
Okay, so every LEA adopts it.
Practice testing between them.
Okay, every LEA adopts a time frame within a bigger frame. We've got to be able to provide that test. We've got to get the information back before the school year's over. That's got to happen. At some point, that's got to happen. Now, we're started next year with the aspect that beginning next year, we're going to release a huge part of all those questions. And that's going to be there for the purpose of being able to review and understand why we got things right and why can we miss things. So, but it's coming. But we'll eventually get a network that will handle the load.
I just had a daughter graduate from UT this December, but had any of you been at UT's Neyland Stadium about 4 or 5 years ago and tried to send a text message
Yes.
while a football game was going on? Welcome to TN Ready. Now, finally, the cell phone people kind of figured out. I mean, it used to say, I think, Verizon in one of the I have Verizon. I couldn't get a signal out of because there were too many people tapping into the same. Welcome to TN Ready. I mean, we're going to get there. It's going to happen, and it's just going to take a little bit more time. And by the way, we went back to the provider, and we're not coming up with money for this. You didn't give us a product that worked, so that's a good thing. Because sometimes we've had state government computer programs that crashed, and we were just out $20 or $30 or $80 million. That hasn't happened in this case.
All right, we're now open for questions. Surely someone in here has some questions about education. Russ, anything happening at local schools, Russ or Patty? Anything you guys need to know from our legislators?
I think there's always a lot happening in schools. I think it's legislatively, I think everything's pretty understandable right now. I think one thing that we're personally watching very closely is legislation around bus transportation and boost warranty and enforcement of the communication devices and everything. We're very interested in that. I don't know if anybody's got anything on that they would want to hear.
Did the seat belts on buses, what happened to that? Didn't pass, right?
It didn't make it out of committee, but I know there is a bill about raising the penalty for texting while driving on a school bus.
Right.
I think there was one at one point just to do an all-out ban. So we are aware, we are reacting as quickly as we can to these issues that do come up, especially as passionate as people are locally about that. And Harry mentioned this earlier. I am finally thrilled that we are going to release some of our test questions to our teachers. Here's what you may not realize. For the last 20 or 30 years, when a teacher would give a standardized test, it was an invisible target that she was shooting for, he was shooting for. You would have the standards and you would have the textbook, but then the test questions were written somewhere else. And you never knew, did you get it right? Did you get it kind of right? Were you totally in left field? In fact, we banned teachers from ever seeing the questions. They couldn't even help students many times on their questions. And it was giving them an invisible target. And then we wondered why they're frustrated. People wanted 100% of the questions released. Well, I'm thinking you giving somebody 70% of the questions, you can get the general gist, but it's not teaching. The teachers won't have the inside track to teach to the test because we're changing the questions every year. But at least we have if you've ever written test questions, I've got an education degree and they teach you how to write test questions. You get a rhythm. You can kind of see how the question's formatted. And that gives teachers the idea that they may have to tweak some of their teaching skills in order to go, okay, because some of these questions are really, really deep. I saw one about golf balls years ago, and it was, you got 200,000 golf balls in 2010, and you got 215,000 golf balls in 2011. How many golf balls will you make in 2012 based on growth? Okay, golf balls are sold in sets of a dozen. How many dozen did you make? And oh, by the way, yellow golf balls are sold in a ratio of 3-to-1 from white golf balls. This is what we're asking 6th graders. That was a 6th grade question to figure out. But if the teacher doesn't know that that's the depth that the test questionnaire is digging for, she could have taught ratios, which was the 3-to-1 part. She could have taught division with the 12 sold in a dozen. But having her know to put all these things together to teach our children to get to this level, now you're going to somewhat know what the mindset of the academic people who are creating these questions are.
Yes. Commissioner Thomas, go ahead.
Well, first of all, when I heard Brooks and Dunn was going to be here,
You got all excited. Plus Kane.
Kane the wrestler is here. He's in my district, by the way.
The diversity question, which doesn't seem to go away, I don't think the funding was really the thing. It was maybe a leadership snafu or something. The funding was the only way to get their attention. Would you say that's a fair statement, that we just don't like the way the leadership was leading that? It seems like the office of diversity, we should be not trying to get everybody to conform, but getting everybody to accept everyone with their differences.
Celebrate the difference.
But I think when it comes to funding, I just wish they would just zero-based budgeting and start again. Because it's like you said, if it gets down to we want everyone to feel welcomed, there's this little saying, treat others the way you'd like to be treated. You don't need 50 people making 6-figure incomes to get to that. If you have leadership and they get every professor, every person who works at UT to say that is our mission, you will have your students and drill into them, treat others the way you would like to be treated, you can go a long way. And so I think when it comes to funding, I think they need to go back and say, what are we trying to reach, and how do we get there most effectively? As the wrestler Kane said just a little while ago, you know, if we're bean counting, well, they're spending $5 million to, in some cases, have the metric go in the opposite direction. And so, anyways, let's take some more questions, since I think we've talked enough.
Okay.
Hi, thank you for being here today.
Welcome back.
Thank you. I have a question about diversity, but in the K-12 setting, because you all represent Knox County, which is a very diverse metropolitan area, and we have a lot of students with different levels of needs. And I would say from my experience as a teacher and a parent that a classroom of 20 and a classroom of 30, you know, sounds like you know, the classroom of 20 would definitely be easier. But if your students, you know, half of them are English language learners and a quarter of them has special needs or some sort of risk factors that make it harder, then that class of 20 is just as hard, if not harder, for the teacher to succeed in and the students to succeed in. So if you agree with that, which I don't know if you do, but I think a lot of teachers would back me up on that sort of idea, how can we support you all in the legislature to support equitable funding? So the funding from the state reflects the actual cost of educating kids, which varies. It's not, kids are not widgets. Some kids cost more to get to that same level. You know, and we need to reflect that in the funding on the state level. I know locally we do a little bit, you know, in terms of taking economic levels of schools to pay lunch rate, but I know you all care a lot about this and know a lot about this. So what can we do in Knoxville to support you in those efforts? Or what are you doing, or what's happening that we can help further?
We, this last summer, spent multiple meetings, and I think these two gentlemen were there at some of the meetings, and we looked at the process. Do we have the BEP approach? Do we do a per dollar amount per child with a different factor for English language learners, for special needs, for socioeconomic environment? In other words, like a 1.0 typical student, 1.8 special needs. And so the funding would be predicated on that. We didn't wind up in that direction, but we wound up in a direction that put more money into special ed, English language learners, more money in reference to school systems. We created an environment that if you were in a lower half of the salaries, the money had to go to salaries. There was a caveat in the governor's budget, so if you looked at, if your salary was below the average number, then it went into that particular, had to go there. So, but we tried it. The governor's philosophy is to maintain local options. While it goes to a component, the local leaders can decide what to use that with and how to do it. So that's been his approach from beginning to end. So, but we've recognized that issue. We've tried to address it with the current BEP instead of moving to a different methodology.
And I would advise anything you can do in the home. I know we keep coming back to this, but when you look at the funding spent in Farragut, and then you look at the funding spent, say, at Fulton or Austin East, it's a huge difference. But the results at one don't respect. What I'm saying is we're spending more money at some other schools to get worse results. So that to me is where, if anything's spent on the home, improving parent engagement, you know, that's what I think most of us struggle with a lot, is how do, that is the missing link in this entire thing to get great education, is having a, you know, even in preschool, having a parent just read to a child, talk to a child, go on a walk. I mean, these don't cost anything. But, you know, I'm a new grandpa, and I see how much my daughter actually talks to her 3-month-old, who can't understand any of it, but the baby's talking back. because it's a good home environment, because and that will go leaps and bounds in this child's education once she gets to kindergarten and you know, if she does pre-K, and because mom and dad just don't park you in front of a TV and leave you there because they got other things to do with their life. So anything you can do to encourage parenting and home life will totally take us in another direction educationally, because the children will be engaged.
One more question.
First of all, I'd like to introduce myself. I passed away Kane University, teaching cybersecurity IT. But I wanted to first tell you that I'm new to Tennessee, fairly new to Tennessee. I've worked in another state for many years, and I just wanted to thank you for a very different conversation than I've heard at any of the panels I've been to in other states, as well as any legislator conversation. So I see a difference here. It's very enlightening to be here. My question is, as a new higher education professor, how can I, or what do you think would be the best route for me to mentor folks in need? So in other words, I've heard, I believe was it Dunn who mentioned Tennessee Promise Mentor? Would that be the best?
There's the folks over here.
Yeah, so if you guys know of any path that I can take to get to know the Tennessee.
Right there. He will sign you up.
Okay, great. Got my heart. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. All right, okay.
You were talking about addressing issues at the home in order to improve education. And I was wondering if there was anything because that is one option for bringing the community together in the school to solve the community problems and family issues.
Well, last year we did pass. Was it last year we passed a law?
Sometime recently.
It was either last year or the year before we passed, because Knoxville had been so successful with the community school movement. And by the way, guys, we created the Tennessee Promise here too. Okay, we are an innovator in great educational ideas, because it started here and then it was rolled out statewide. Same thing with the community schools. We passed a law to allow community schools across the state, and now it's just up to the local LEA to engage. You know, we allow them the flexibility to do that, and now it's a state law. You can do these things, and then they just have to find the partners to go with them to make sure that those community schools are open. And it's not for every community, but it can have a huge advantage, especially in communities that maybe mom can't help with homework because mom can't read. Community school can help with that. Maybe mom can't, get school clothes for the children because she's a poor money manager. We can fix that at the community school level too. But, we can help with homework. We can help. Maybe mom's not feeding you. That's maybe why you're not or dad, you're not thriving. That's how the community school can step in, and it's at that community's level, and it can create incredible results that we can't do from the state level.
Thank you. I want to say how fortunate we are in Knox County to have these three gentlemen engaged in education in our state.